Welcome, everyone. This is the Herbert C. Kelman seminar on international conflict. Thank you all for coming today. We have a wonderful session planned for you, and you're not going to be disappointed, I promise you. But before we get started, let me just say that this seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And we have James Kerwin here, who is the Assistant Executive Director. And yeah, we're just really thrilled that we have so many of you from all over the world. And I know for some of you it's late at night, early morning. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time. And I wanted to also let you know a little bit about the format of the seminar. So as you know, Matt Waldman is going to be talking about why peacemakers fail. And he'll be giving his presentation for about 40 minutes. And then we will turn it over to you for a Q&A. Now, the Q&A, if we're going to ask you, if you could put your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, but the Q&A function, it's just a lot easier for us to identify the questions, and then I will present the questions to Matt. And we will be recording this session. And what that means is that you can come back and take a look at it again if you know someone who might want to see it. In about a week's time, it'll probably be posted on the PON, Program on Negotiation website. So give it a week or so. And if you want to take a look at the recording, you can find it there in the events section. And what else can I tell you? I think this is going to be a wonderful presentation. I would just like to tell you a little bit about Matt Waldman's background. He's an associate at Oxford University Center for International Studies, a senior advisor at the European Institute of Peace, and a director of the Center for Empathy and International Affairs. Matt has served as special advisor to UN envoys for Afghanistan, Syria, Somalia, and Yemen. He has undertaken mediation work in the Middle East and Africa with the European Institute of Peace and Intermediate. Matt has also undertaken academic research on psychology and foreign policy making, conflict resolution, and mediation effectiveness as a fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School and at the Law School, in addition to the Fletcher School at Tufts University and Cambridge University. So our friend Matt Waldman gets around. And again, you will not be disappointed in this. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to turn the table over to James Kerwin, and he's going to just let you know about other upcoming PON events. So Matt, without further ado, here you are. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Donna, for that kind welcome. And thank you all for joining today. I'm really happy to join this seminar again, especially it's an honor, of course, to speak at a seminar in Herb Kelman's name. I'm sorry for the rather fatalistic title of this presentation, which I shall blame on the English weather. The PowerPoint also is rather limited. It is intended to give you a structure of the talk. And let me get going then with my central contention. And that is that I think peacemakers, or what I will call mediators in this talk, what they do is almost always difficult. I think it's made more difficult by a challenging international environment. But also there are many areas where mediation efforts themselves are flawed and deficient. To remain relevant and enhance its impact, I think the mediation field needs to change, and that will require concerted action and a sense of urgency. So there are 5 parts to the talk that I'm putting on the slide: the research itself, the challenges mediators face, the flaws and deficiencies that are identified in this research, responses to those issues, and then 5 propositions for a way ahead. So, first of all, then, the research itself. And the context for that research is the wider field, of course, peacemaking. And my research focused on mediation, the mediation of armed conflict, and indeed the effectiveness of that work. The background, of course, is something we're all familiar with. There are more armed conflicts worldwide than any point since 1946. There are a litany of protracted conflicts that we have seen in recent years: Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Mali, the list goes on. And though war deaths have fallen in recent years, as we all know, conflicts continue to have a devastating impact on people around the world. And of course, we now have the highest number of displaced people in 75 years. And I think it is worth recalling that 80% of the world's humanitarian needs are driven by conflict. We've seen many attempts to mediate armed conflict in recent years, but relatively few successes, especially in the past decade, as opposed to the 30-some peace agreements we saw in the 2 decades that followed the end of the Cold War. Of course, I would argue that in itself is the rationale for a focus on mediation effectiveness. So the research itself. I undertook interviews with 86 mediation specialists. These are the world's leading mediators, experts, and scholars with mediation experience. And I asked them on a non-attributable basis, in effect, one question: what could be done to enhance the effectiveness of mediation in armed conflict? And the effectiveness, the definition that we used, was making progress towards sustainable peace. In other words, I was asking what needs to change for the mediation field to have greater impact. And the response was overwhelming. It really was an outpouring of insights and views, mainly critiques of mediation practice, occasionally adorned with colorful language. And I'm currently engaged in going through that huge amount of material. Of course, there's a lot of theoretical and comparative work in this area. Of course, I'm sure you're familiar with the work on ripeness, or credible commitments, a lot of other work, and indeed work that looks at specific cases, and that's hugely important. Of course, this work that I've undertaken is different because it directly engages on a pretty systematic basis mediators themselves and specialists. Of course, it is limited in that it relies on opinions. It's not hard facts, but I think it matters. I think it's important to know what practitioners and experts think. And between them, the interviewees have over 1,500 years of mediation experience. I think that testimonial evidence is something we should take seriously as we develop an agenda for developing mediation practice. So my reflections today are based on that research. I'll share quotes from the interviews. Of course, it's only a few of the the many interviews I conducted. And I should also say there have been recent discussions on mediation effectiveness convened by USIP, the Volker Bernadotte Academy, and others, which I will draw on. And I offer these observations with humility, recognizing there's a lot of experience in this community, and indeed a diversity of views. This is ongoing research, so I don't come with answers, but I do come with critical concerns about mediation practice. Forgive me for generalizations. We don't have that long, so I think that that is necessary and in a way, I will outline a selection, a flavor of issues that have been raised in the course of this research. I do recognize that disaggregation is needed between different types of mediators, different forms of mediation, and different conflicts. But we do, I think, have to contend as well with broad critiques, which I will be sharing today. So I want to start with that key question, which is why in so many cases are mediation efforts not succeeding? Of course, it's difficult to say because all cases are different. And one thing that we can do, though, perhaps, is to distinguish between endogenous and exogenous factors. In other words, those factors connected with the mediation world itself and the world outside of mediation. But I want to start with the latter, the challenges that mediators face. And of course, there are intrinsic challenges that mediators face. I think resolving armed conflict is one of the most difficult endeavors on planet Earth. The very fact that there is armed conflict signifies, of course, major differences between the parties. The drivers of conflict are so powerful, as we all know, the reaction so often to perceived aggression or injustice. People are defending their lives and what they see as vital interests or values. And again, as we're all aware, conflict is driven forward by emotions and cognitive biases which amplify hostility. Then in what is perceived as a zero-sum, even existential contest, that impetus to fight is so often inexorable. As one expert put it to me, mediation will always be effing difficult. What we are offering as mediators, compromise, accommodation, mutual coexistence, they're locked in a deadly struggle trying to exterminate each other. The miracle is that it sometimes works. Interviewees also pointed to the limited power of mediation. The fact that mediators often have limited leverage and rarely coercive power. As one practitioner put it to me, I see mediation as a second-order tool. I don't see it as a tool that will transform international relations structurally. Of course, that's consistent with rightness theory that anticipates the best chance of success when there's a mutually hurting stalemate. So, first of all, I want to acknowledge that it is almost always incredibly difficult, and usually mediators have limited power and agency. But then, and this is something that was raised by virtually all of the interviewees, the operating environment, the other major exogenous factor, the conditions in which mediation takes place. I'm only going to briefly mention this, but I do think that these factors are incredibly powerful, make this work very, very difficult. I will mention 5 here that came up time and time again. One, the fact that we are now in a divided, contested, multipolar world. Great power rivalry is back, polarizing and paralyzing the United Nations Security Council in so many cases. So often profound disagreement on international issues. As one put it to me, I don't know of any case where there is a united international response to a conflict. Those conditions, of course, undermine political will to resolve or prevent armed conflict. As one UN envoy put it to me, it seems to me purposeful international action is at its lowest. And of course, with that, there are lower political costs for parties who choose to resist or withdraw from or manipulate mediation efforts. Thirdly, that we're all familiar with is the internationalization of civil conflict. Think of Syria, Libya, Yemen, and how major and regional powers are pursuing their strategic interests through backing parties to armed conflict. As one expert put it to me, international, regional and international involvement has stepped up to a completely different level. One UN envoy said, it was just hard to think of a conflict that would not been internationalized. I recall one practitioner telling me he spent 18 months working with Syrian armed groups to develop a negotiating framework with them. And when they consulted their main external backer, in just 2 hours, they were told that that wasn't viable, that wasn't going to happen, and they were being pulled out of the process. The fourth factor is the changing nature of conflict, again, that we're all familiar with, the fragmentation, the complexity, the rise and proliferation of non-state actors. And with that, the ambiguity of proxy, hybrid, gray zone warfare, and of technological advances, which mean that conflicts are being conducted on, at that level too, in terms of cyber operations or misinformation campaigns. And the fifth factor, I think, that was mentioned often was the rise of authoritarianism. Of course, we've seen a spate of coups in Africa and a perceived erosion of democracy in the West, which again, interviewees pointed to as undermining or what is largely seen as a liberal peacemaking agenda. Looking ahead, I think there are two other factors that are going to make things even harder. Climate change, of course, putting huge pressure on scarce resources and all the implications that that has. And then Ukraine, already having a massive impact on food, energy, and finance. But I think it goes far wider than that. The signification of the return of interstate conflict, I think it's clear the West is entering a new Cold War with Russia and will likely enter some kind of Cold War with China in the near future. We will see a global contest for supremacy, which will have, I think, severe implications for conflict resolution work. But let me go now to the endogenous factors, the factors related to mediation itself. And I want to just start with just some overarching reflections on this. And that is that there is a very strong sense amongst the mediation world that mediation efforts are not succeeding. As one put it to me, one mediator, there's a common agreement that we're in trouble. And we're in a crisis. Mediation, it's in a crisis, though we won't call it a crisis. Of course, there is no question a lot of good and important work being done. And that was recognized in the interviews. And indeed, much of it is not acknowledged more widely. But at the same time, there really is, I think, a consensus that mediation is struggling. And there are two dimensions to this. On the one hand, the sense that mediation capacities and methods are lagging behind geopolitics, not adapting to the new environment which I have described. As one expert put it to me, mediation's working from an unrealistic and outdated playbook, pointing to the fact that much of the methods emerged in the 1990s. But of course, there are also real flaws and deficiencies, regardless of geopolitics, and a sense amongst many that some of the fundamentals have not been mastered. And that's what I want to go through in this section. And I do want to suggest that we have not been fully honest with ourselves as a community, the mediation community, about our weaknesses. I think that's common in many fields. There's perhaps an element of denial here, but I certainly find that what is said privately or non-attributably is not shared more widely. Of course, there's a problem that all the incentives work the other way. There's a need to protect reputations and generate income for institutions. Let me go on to these four, I think, main areas where interviewees pointed to flaws and deficiencies. Firstly, goals and methods. And again, forgive me for going briefly through these due to time constraints, but I do want to just bring some of this this substance to your attention. The first is that goals are so often overambitious, as one UN envoy put it to me, a Christmas tree of laudable objectives which are a threat to the peace agreement itself. And of course, people have pointed out to me that mandates sometimes contain an array of objectives which are not even achieved in highly developed societies. That mediation is becoming, as another put it to me, an ideal. It's actually a sort of fantasy, in their words. Along with that, there was almost universal agreement that timeframes are too short. As one put it, some in this field want instant gratification. They want the Nobel Peace Prize, then bugger off. Several, and more than that, of the interviews made the point to me that it is just unrealistic to try to transform societies in months or even years, that it is going to take much, much longer than that, and that time is not being factored into current processes. There is a sense that processes are not being well designed or managed. And just to give you two examples, a lot of concern with the obsession with peace agreements rather than changing the relationships between the parties. As one put it to me, you can have a perfect text and no agreement, no genuine agreement, which of course leads to future problems. Others raise concerns about highly public processes that are more theatre than real negotiations. Think of the Geneva talks on Syria. As an envoy put it to me, the base of a negotiation is discretion, the chance of creating a protected environment for the real issues, the sense that that wasn't always happening. And there was a sense of a neglect of implementation. As one leading African mediator said to me, what she sees is an agreement has been reached, then is signed, sealed, the champagne is open, and then everybody disappears. You don't see progress. You arrive at the point when the agreement collapses. And of course, that perhaps helps explain why, within 5 years of signing a peace agreement, close to half of those agreements collapse. More broadly, I think there's a critique there as well that we tend to think in linear and sequential terms, distinct phases of trust building, negotiation, agreement, implementation. And what I kept hearing was that does not reflect the reality on the ground, the complex, shifting dynamics. I want to come to the second area where, of concerns about practice and capacities and skills. Firstly, resources. Of course, funding has increased for mediation work, but one has to consider this in a global context where military spending is some $2 trillion every year, and 0.1% of that amount is spent on peace building and conflict resolution. And as one very influential mediator said to me, mediation is just scratching the surface of what it can contribute to and needs to contribute to the planet. There's also concerns about the form of funding, that it's too projectivized and short-term, echoing the concerns I mentioned above. There are concerns about the appointments to senior mediator positions. In fact, I would say there's overwhelming concern about this, that too often diplomats or politicians with no experience of mediation are appointed. And of course, there can be advantages to those kinds of backgrounds, but obviously they need the right team around them and are liable to make misjudgments. As one put it to me, they lack the art and science of mediation. But certainly, I would say huge concern around the who is appointed to mediation positions. And that links to the next point about qualities and skills. And here there was a widespread concern that mediators and senior people in the field lack social and emotional intelligence. And with some telling me they think this is the element that has been missing at a track 1 level. There's also a critique of of the way in which mediators think. Some say there is a lack of strategic, critical, and creative thinking. Too many unsubstantiated assumptions, that people sign up to things that sound nice, but might not stand up to rigorous analysis against the facts. A lack of rigor in developing and applying theories of change. One thinks of, the process on Afghanistan, and how, it was hard to see how a process that revolved around an American withdrawal from Afghanistan was going to lead to an inclusive and sustainable peace. And of course, too often, as my interviews believed, people were not thinking creatively beyond dialogue. As this one senior official put it, we somehow believe that all the problems in the world have a solution if enlightened men and women simply sit down and are made to see clearly what their own interests are. Again, just pointing to that lack of creative thinking. The third area was one that's perhaps surprising, was knowledge gaps. There was a lot of, widespread sense that there's a lack of local or contextual knowledge. I remember one individual saying he was just stunned at the lack of even basic knowledge in Libya among some of the UN officials he was engaged with about Libyan society, its history, and a lack also as in other areas. So insights into the psychology of people being engaged, and into very different areas, political economy in the private sector. So in other areas of under this bracket, people were very concerned about lack of mediation expertise. That's given the prevalence for diplomats, former bureaucrats to be engaged in this work, far less experience, a direct experience of mediation. As one put it to me, key recommendation is fix the personnel. And finally, in this bracket really is the question of learning. And a real, what has been identified as a reluctance to really rigorously identify what can be learned from previous work. And indeed, one expert put it to me that there were some parts of the UN, like the WHO, which was serious about really gathering knowledge and applying it. And he said that that those involved at mediation in the United Nations were at the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So a lot of concern about that, and a lot of concern about the huge, what's many describe as a huge gap between research and practice. And finally, a concern about systems. And here, I think we found concern, but differences of opinion. So if one thinks of, first of all, coherence, and there was, obviously, there's been an emerging field, and mediation has seen a proliferation of different actors. Some think that's a good thing, different horses for different courses. Others, very concerned. UN envoy described to me this hungry and competitive feast, the kind of, as he put it, the chaos and cacophony, which now swamps a conflict with so many players all pulling in a certain direction. There's also, as I said, a system level concern about professionalization. Some think this is, as one put it, a wild, unregulated space. Another very senior mediator told me, I don't think we've really begun to professionalize. I think we're sort of 20% down the path. We need much, much, much more. Others are concerned about if you seek to establish common standards, do you suppress vibrancy, creativity, or even undercut traditional modes of mediation, which can be highly effective. And thirdly, there was here a division of views about prevention. A very strong sense across the board, really, that this was not sufficiently prioritized, but some believing this was a realm where mediators could do a lot more, and others are seeing it not so directly as a mediation issue. So now I want to turn to the issue of responses. And of course, as I have mentioned, you know, the responses that I got from interviewees were tended to focus on critique of mediation, not exactly putting forward ideas about how to change mediation. But I do think that the required changes are implicit in many of those critiques that I have mentioned. So scrutinizing and improving strategies and methods, reforming funding, expanding timelines, overhauling appointments, strengthening, expanding skills-based training, ensuring diverse teams with mediation expertise, ensuring sufficient contextual knowledge, building evaluation and learning into policies and practice. And all of these things, I mean, are to some extent being done, but there's far more that could be done to address some of those problems, which, as I say, I found quite a lot of agreement among interviewees. When it comes to systems issues, I think there is more debate required. And of course, there may be a need to discuss how to improve coherence and how to potentially strengthen a process of professionalization, not regulation, but efforts to promote and support best practice. Of course, they're the specific issues, but I also want to look at the meta level responses. And here I found it very interesting that there were, I think, three main overarching senses of where mediation should go, how it should respond to this increasingly challenging environment and to the problems that I've mentioned. And the first of those is pragmatism. And there are a considerable constituency, you know, of individuals within the field who think that the emphasis now has to be on being pragmatic, seeing if efforts can be made to end violence that might then open up new possibilities. As one put it to me, we've got to be a bit more modest, what this tool is meant to achieve rather than saving the world. And, you know, it's not about bringing heaven to earth, but preventing this world from going to hell. Really, there's a sense there that if you can end the violence, you can open up new possibilities. And that view was fairly widely held, but not, I don't think, publicly shared, because of course there is certainly a perceived inconsistency and tension there with inclusivity, which some see as a luxury. And as one put it to me, in a world where you're dealing with the Russians, the Saudis, the Qataris, or the Turks, this is not going to be about inclusive peace deals. It's going to be about elite understandings between the most powerful armed actors. Of course, there are critiques to each of these approaches. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but they're critiques. And one critique there, of course, is that actually inclusivity is important, not just on a principle basis, but for pragmatic reasons, because it can help to achieve a more sustainable peace. And indeed, there is, I think, a level of agreement on inclusion of spoilers, potential spoilers, and influencers, far less agreement on the means and modalities of including affected communities. The second area here, a sort of meta-level response, is diffusion. And this, I think, reflects complexity and systems thinking, which I think is increasingly factored into mediation efforts, and really brings about the view that in order to achieve change, you have to engage at multiple levels by multiple means. And very often I find in this respect, there was an emphasis on two factors: localized responses. Of course, that takes the form of local mediation teams, local partners, insider mediators. As one UN envoy put it to me, sustainable peace is built on local sinews. The other dimension there is networks and relationships, and really a very strong view that it is through building, improving, strengthening relationships that conflicts would ultimately be resolved. And the final, I think, of these meta-level responses to the challenges is diversification. And of course, it is an open secret, as one put it to me in those terms, that most mediation organizations are not really mediating, that they're undertaking many other kinds of tasks. And what advocates of this approach say is we should be rethinking our tasks and put forward that those include orchestrating responses, connecting actors in conflict, supporting them, supporting processes, generating ideas for ways forward, persuading people of approaching problems in new ways or thinking about other groups in new ways, and advising the parties. And just as one illustration, in each of these, there's a lot of depth and expansive thinking. But just to take that latter, there really is quite a powerful argument put forward by some that negotiation advice given to all sides, in effect, especially when there's networks between those advisors, is in effect a kind of mediation. So I want to finish them with propositions, 5 of them. And the first is to recognize, I think, that mediation is in trouble. It's a young field, born really in its modern form in the 1990s, a very different world, and is just beginning a process of professionalization. And I think it's clear it is struggling to deliver. And that is partly about changing geopolitics, which makes this difficult work even harder. But I think it's also partly about us, about the mediation world. I don't think we've fully reckoned with ourselves about our limitations and our weaknesses. And I think 2 factors compound and perpetuate this problem. The first is that when we consider lack of success, I think we tend to look outwards rather than inwards. Of course, inwards, it's always more uncomfortable to do that. And this is, that is understandable that we do that given the huge challenges. But I do think there's an element of denial and self-serving bias there, where we tend to internalize success, externalize failure. I think the other factor here is that when we look inward, we tend to focus on specific policies and measures required to address a particular conflict, rather than the structural changes that might be required over the longer term. I think it's a kind of performance paradox in continually trying to do better to address immediate problems. Sometimes we fail to address those underlying factors which might be impeding us from doing so. I think the second proposition here is that the urgent priority should be enhancing effectiveness. I think there's always a risk that as a field expands, it loses sight of its core objective, which is surely promoting sustainable peace. And not that peace, we should always expect to achieve peace, but at least achieve progress towards peace. And I think increasing the likelihood of a positive impact is the best way of remaining relevant, given the real threat from alternative approaches. Think of how Russia resolved the Nagorno-Karabakh war in 2020. The methods used by China, Russia, and other regional powers, which are closer to an elite bargaining paradigm, may be more attractive to some conflict parties. Looking ahead, I think we are moving into a new dark era of geopolitics. It will be dominated by hostile rivalry between major powers. Now, more than ever, we need to raise our game. I think to have a greater impact, we will need to change, that we need to adapt to changing circumstances, to the new geopolitics, to the changing character of war. And we need to improve, not just by innovating, which is required, but by getting the basics right, by addressing those flaws and deficiencies, which were described to me in such depth by so many practitioners, and by addressing system challenges and developing new effective approaches. Clearly, there is no single template, but a huge scope to improve. I think we need a viable process of change. Of course, change could happen incrementally and individually, individuals themselves or organizations, or it could be more concerted. And my own view is that the challenges are too great to rely on slow, piecemeal change. And if something more concerted is required, what would that look like? And the initial indications are that the UN will not lead this work, but can organizations come together? Can we mobilize? Can we build a process of change? And there are precedents in other fields, in humanitarian affairs, in the 1990s, for example, in peacekeeping and elsewhere. And I think it is worth recollecting that we have never, the mediation field has never been subject to a full system-wide review and process of change and reform. And of course, it can take many different forms, but I believe that something concerted will be required. Finally, what I would say about that process is that I think it will require these factors, these attributes: self-scrutiny, diversity, and leadership. Self-scrutiny, I think, is going to be essential, and that needs to be honest. It needs to comprise of a rigorous effort to understand how well are we doing, what works in what circumstances, the disaggregation that I mentioned, what needs to change. That, of course, can help generate an evidence basis and an impetus for a change process. I think it's got to be a diverse process. Of course, it's going to be more effective if it is inclusive of all regions around the world, especially the states in the global south. And it needs also, I think, to be multidisciplinary, drawing on the sister fields of diplomacy and peace building, but then related fields such as conflict studies, IR, political science, psychology. We need, I think, critical analysis and inputs from those fields too. And finally, then leadership. I believe this process, in whatever shape it is formed, it will need a safe space for informed, constructive debate. We'll need to apply lessons from mediation practice, build trust, exchange views, build ownership, and generate ideas for ways forward. So I want to just end on a few final thoughts. Mediation is a limited and imperfect tool. Clearly, every conflict requires a different approach, and it is always hard to say ex ante what will be effective. Of course, mediation needs spontaneity and creativity, but that is no excuse for not being rigorous about ourselves, who we appoint, how we organize, how we operate. And I think we need to do everything possible to maximize the chances of progress. So many people around the world are caught up in the grip of conflict. They depend on that progress for their lives and their livelihoods. And for that, I think we need a sense of urgency and a commitment to change. So I will stop there, and I look forward to further comments and questions.
Oh, Matt, thank you. Well, that was remarkable, Matt, and I thank you so much for sharing all of that work that you've done and the insights. Honestly, having been a practitioner for a couple of decades, I can say the issues were alive then when I started doing this work. And I just think that you've chronicled them and that you made it so obvious for us where we as a field have to move. So that's just invaluable. And thank you so very much. I know we have several questions here. Peter Boger is asking you, given human nature and history of armed conflict over time, why would one assume the starting assumption is that conflicts can be successfully mediated rather than that being a fortuitous exception?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. And in a way, I think one should not start with the assumption that they can be mediated. One needs to come to each conflict, I think, with an open mind and examine the conditions and all dimensions and factors relating to the specific conflict, and look for opportunities and possibilities. And I think that is what mediators are in the business of doing. And I do think that even though in many cases it seems unrealistic to expect to be able to achieve peace in the short or medium term, sometimes there is important work that can be done to at least make progress towards peace. Sometimes that is about trying to change the relationships or the attitudes between groups. And that is, of course, long-term work. And even though that may not yield results in and of itself, I think that in later years, that can be instrumental. It can be a really important factor. And certainly Northern Ireland comes to mind, and was where that point made to me that it took many years of painstaking work, relationship building with different constituencies and armed factions to finally get to the point where a peace agreement was possible. So I accept that this is very, very difficult work. I think we have to be realistic, and yet there is a lot that can be achieved short of peace that may pave the way to future peace.
Okay, Matt, thank you. So our friend and colleague Joshua Weiss has a question for you. Matt, how do we define failure in this context? As you know, in many peace processes, there are many failed processes that ultimately lead to success. Is there a taxonomy of failure from temporary setback to catastrophic collapse? I think you've already addressed a bit of this question, but go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, and again, it's another great question, and I think we do have to think this through, and that there are and you need to, I think, examine each case on its own merits and think about each particular set of circumstances that are under consideration. And there may be work that really actually makes no difference or is even detrimental to a future peace, and there may be work that actually can take you further forward in limited ways, but important ways. There also may be work that can mitigate the impact of conflict, and I think that indeed is a form of success. But I think ultimately the measure here of success is progress towards sustainable peace, and if you like, failure is the converse of that.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Martin von Tersch, I hope I pronounced that right. The US never joined the International Criminal Court, initially on recommendation of President Clinton, with Madeleine Albright as Secretary of State. Russia exited the ICC after its annexation of Crimea. How does this history impact mediation, conflict mediation?
Well, I've got to be honest, say that is not an area that I study and would be equipped to answer. And all I would say is that it struck me that international justice and accountability did not feature prominently in the answers that I heard from my interviewees. Given that this is something that, of course, there is such a rich history of scholarly work and actually real action and developments in the field, I think this is something that clearly needs to be part of any change process for mediation. There needs to be a real dialogue between those who work in this area and those who are working in mediation, because clearly there are links and relationships between the two.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Goncha Somez Pool is asking you, commenting, thank you for your very detailed as well as quite honest presentation. I would like you to comment on one aspect of mediation work, and that is the why for those who get involved in the processes, not necessarily mediators, but as participants in conflict resolution processes and workshops. Isn't this part of why some of the work does not succeed? Because individuals and or groups all have various agendas, agendas of their own, apart from finding peace.
Yes, and there's no question that that is the case, and that many of the actors who are involved in these processes are not necessarily sincere about seeing whether peace is possible. We certainly have seen, I mean, Syria comes to mind. It's very hard to believe that the Syrian regime was serious about negotiations, and indeed most of the world's experts believe that they were not. Of course, you know, that sometimes it is easier to say with hindsight where there is that lack of interest, and I think one should start with at least the aspiration to engage those who demonstrate a genuine interest in seeking to either resolve or mitigate the conflict. And certainly in my own experience, which is relatively diverse, I've seen there are those, often at leadership positions within you know, non-state armed groups, and indeed on the sides of governments and military alliances, who are interested in the potential for negotiated outcomes. And I've almost always found that they work alongside those who are against any kind of engagement and the prospects for a negotiated outcome. But I think part of the mediation process is engaging those constituents who are interested in talks and trying perhaps to then encourage them, maybe even give momentum or strength to those groups, and seeing if you can strengthen a process by those means. Of course, ultimately, the only way that you ever know whether there is genuine interest is to test, is to engage and see what is derived from a mediation process. And I think there's relatively little to lose. You know, these are rarely very costly, but if you test, if you try, that is the surest way, I think, of knowing whether there is sincere intentions there or not.
Yeah. Okay, Mark Wickman said that one study demonstrated clearly that in order for true engagement to occur, participants must experience psychological safety. In the context of the type of mediation being discussed, how can a psychologically safe place be established so that the parties truly engage authentically in a mediation process?
I think it's another very good point. And as I mentioned in the talk, there was, I think, you know, a lot of you know, sense amongst the interviewees that the psychological dimension of conflict and of conflict resolution work have been neglected. That was an area where mediators could expand their knowledge and understanding and their skills. And so I think it's appropriate to consider those safe spaces. And I think I agree. You do need safe spaces for people to be able to speak more candidly about their real interests or their real concerns and fears in order to address them, because ultimately that is what a successful process would seek to do, to really address those needs and those interests, and for people to speak openly, that you do need that protected space. And indeed, you do see in practice that over years of engagement and trust building, you can get to the point where you really do acquire that deep understanding of what somebody is really thinking and feeling and perceiving. But that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort, and it's something that perhaps, yes, as you suggest, that should be a greater focus of mediation efforts.
Right. Okay, Matt, I think this is going to be our last question, because then I'll have to turn this over to James Kerwin to close. But Jim Tull, our friend and colleague again, is asking this: as this young field matures and continues to adapt in the 21st century, where should leadership be based? Academia, government, sub-government organizations? Is it United States Institute of Peace? Is it the UN? Are it various NGOs, youth organizations? Where should it be based?
Well, I think that is for the field to decide. My instinct is that it can be a level of collaborative leadership, and of course we'll need individual leaders. But I believe that in the many different constituencies and organizations and segments of the wider field that you mentioned, that there should be and there can be participation and engagement in this process. But I think it is required that we'll need to work together to address some of these problems, which seem to be so widespread. And it's not that there isn't really quite impressive work being undertaken in the field. There is, but there are many areas where we can do better. And I think coming together, many people with that determination to do better, that is a great starting point to then try to reflect, to self-scrutinize and figure out what can change. So I really hope that there will be that kind of concerted effort at a wider level to really try to upgrade mediation capacities.
You know, Matt, I was thinking, just in following that question about who should be in charge, academia or where, I was thinking the content of your findings could be an outline for a fantastic course somewhere, or maybe in many universities, but really delving into those issues that you've raised and to try to figure out what answers, how do we come up with answers to those issues that you have, so profoundly put out for us. So I want you to think about that, creating a course for us. It would be a wonderful contribution. So Matt, thank you so much. I'm going to have to turn this over to James Kerwin. And again, it was just a very, very powerful presentation, and we so appreciate your being here with us today.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you, Donna, and thank you, Matt. We have fond memories of your time here at PON as a research fellow, and thank you for sharing your work with us today. You gave us a lot to think about, so we really appreciate it. Also, just want to let folks know about upcoming things at the Program on Negotiation. We're excited to be bringing back executive education in person in Cambridge. But we're also going to be offering virtual one-day programs as well. We found that the Zoom format works quite well for kind of getting the knowledge out there. So we hope to see you at a future event. We don't have any talks scheduled just yet, but there are a few in the works, so please monitor your email. And just in closing, I want to thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Enjoy the rest of your day.